I'm at my limit. Please, you have something to him.
I had reached the end of my patience.
What the hell out of the blue?
It's not out of the blue. I've asked many times before, haven't I? You should have told him too. I
I appealed to my husband to ask my brother-in-law to leave the house.
You're asking me to kick my brother out of the house, even though he has nowhere else to go. How can you say such a thing about your sister-in-law?
Right. You're really a scum. The one who came at me was my husband's mother. This is the story of my own family member who was a total jerk. My name is Lisa. I married my current husband, Mike, who is 28 years old. We met on an arranged marriage. It was my boss's recommendation. I have been devoted to karate since childhood. When I was a student, love was a sec concern. I spent every day in karate and balanced it with my studies. Of course, after I entered the work, had no desire to get married, but I had never been in love. Proper was difficult for me to find a boy. I didn't really know how to build a relationship with a man. My boss at work was concerned about me. He introduced me to my current husband, who was a good friend of his. My first impression of him was that kind man. He was a government employee, but he was very calm, like a pacifist. I wanted to get married by the time if possible. I took a liking to him, and I immediately accepted his offer of a relationship. The rest of our relationship went well, and it didn't take long for us to fall in love with each other. I especially liked his honesty, and I thought I might be able to make this man. After a while, he proposed to me, and I readily accepted. We were to be married. My parents, who are wealthy and own houses as vacation homes, gave me one of their houses. You can choose any house you like. I chose a house that was just right, not too big, not too small. It was a normal house, a little bigger than normal house. It had enough room for a child to stand up and a garden. It was convenient for transportation. There were stores nearby, so I chose this house. My husband, who usually doesn't show emotions too much, said to me at that moment,
Wow, it's amazing. Is it really okay to have such a splendid house?
I remember my husband muttering apologetically. Our happy life was about to begin. I had no doubt in my mind. The wedding ceremony ended without, and our newlywed life began. A few months later, however, my father-in-law, who had been suffering from a chronic illness, passed away. My husband has one younger brother, but I never had a chance to see him as he was living and working in a far-off suburb. I met him for the first time at a wedding, and the next time was only his father-in-law's funeral. With the death of my father-in-law, my mother-in-law was left alone at our house. My husband began to contact my mother frequently. It is true that my husband was the brother, and perhaps he felt responsible as the eldest son. It is not hard to understand why he worried about his mother, who was let. However, I was busy with work at the time, and my home was the only place where I could relax. I was a little concerned that my mother-in-law was sitting. There is a matter of course when I came home. One day, after a few months of such, my husband said to me,
Hey Lisa, what do you think about moving in with us?
What?
I was puzzled by my husband's sudden decision.
What is this out of the blue? She here so often already.
When I said that, he replied,
It must be hard for her to come all this way every time. So why doesn't she just come and live with us?
My husband said with a twinkle in it. It was as if he had just come up with the best idea of the lifetime.
Wait a minute. I don't know how to, when you say that out of the blue. We have our own lives to lead.
I pleaded with him.
This house is too big for the two. We've got plenty of room. I think my mother would benefit if we lived together.
He did not listen to my opinion. After that, I didn't react well. My husband kept on talking. He told me he was worried about leaving Mom alone if anything happened to him. To be honest, I wasn't too keen on it at first because we had just started our new life as newlyweds. But if my husband was worried, Cole, no. When I was mulling over my answer, my mother-in-law sold her family home. I was half forced into a situation where I had to accept my mother-in-law. At first, I blamed my husband, who the liberty of talking to her.
We don't have a family home anymore, no place to live, and I don't have choice.
I lost all interest in talking back. After that, my life was mentally disrupted, was not harassed by what is commonly referred to as wife baiting. But I did receive a lot of criticism from my mother-in-law.
You are the wife, you know.
I hated it.
You are married to my son, so you are a daughter-in-law. And as a daughter-in-law, you should serve your husband with love and respect.
She seemed to have such an old-fashioned way of thinking. If I put my work first for a moment, would say to me,
You are a wife. Please be more aware of this.
she said this repeatedly. Because of this, after my mother-in-law came to town, I couldn't stand to be in the same room with her. Days at work became more and more frequent as I had to work overtime. I was able to deal with the sarcastic comments from my mother-in-law in my everyday life. I was still able to live an ordinary life. That is, until something like this. A few years later, my brother-in-law told me that he will be losing his job at the end of the year and moving back in with his parents. My brother-in-law, who had been living and working in the suburbs for years without ever contacting us, suddenly reported this to me, my husband, and our parents. My husband, my mother-in-law, and I were all surprised by the suddenness of her death. And there was something more we had about. The place he was coming back to had been sold and was gone. There was no place for him to live pleased. My brother-in-law, who was on his way to his parents' house, blamed my husband's mother for selling the house without permission.
I didn't hear anything about your new house. I decided to write about my own because I wanted to share my experience with others who may be going through a similar situation.
My brother-in-law is what is commonly referred to as a mischievous person. He was not only flamboyant in appeal, also rough in tone. To be honest, I didn't like that guy. I wanted to stay away from them as possible.
I'm sorry. But I was worried about living in that house by herself. I thought you were going to live and work for a long time.
My husband tried to calm him down, but his brother-in-law replied,
Oh, I don't know. You can't just decide to be a writer. It takes years of practice and dedication. Take responsibility, you shitty broke.
He yelled this to my husband. My husband was supposed to be the brother, but he just freaked out at a comment from my brother-in-law. In the end, he couldn't say anything, just turned pale and looked down. In the first place, my father-in-law's death had said,
If something were to happen to me's, leave everything to my wife.
These were his words. My brother-in-law left his parents without permission, worked in the S, and did not send money home. Does he have the right to blame his and his brother? I was thinking that, but in the end, we couldn't come to an agreement. My brother-in-law ended up living in the house on the condition that he would find another job as soon as possible. As expected, I didn't like it.
I didn't want your brother to live too.
Our living expenses have increased since your mother moved in. I tried to complain.
Just bear with it for now.
He responded to me. I could not just refuse and kick him. He said that. I had no choice but to have even my brother-in-law move in with us. At this point, my mentality had beer to a pulp. But the really hard part came after. After 3 months, my brother-in-law still not looking for a job. He didn't look at job openings. He just spent his days lounging around in the living room. He would stay in his room and play loudly. He spent hours alone watching TV in the living room. My stress was building up more, and to top it all off, I had just come work.
Is dinner ready yet? Do the laundry quickly, will you?
I was treated like a housekeeper. I could not stand it any longer and complained to my husband.
Hey, about your brother. Can't you do something about the way he treats me like I'm his housekeeper?
Housekeeper. He thinks of you as he and adores you.
My husband laughed.
He adores me. What do you mean? He around. I'm treated like a housekeeper. I'm not a servant in this house.
When I got so emotional, he said,
That's fine. Lisa is my wife.
my anger reached its peak.
I'm your wife, not your brother's.
Oh, you're making too much noise. That's not good. You're not his wife, but you're still his sister-in-law. Don't cause any trouble and just do your work. Got it?
That's what he finally said to me. Frankly, I was disappointed in this of my husband. In this house, if only I put up with everything, it would be all right. That's what my husband seemed to think. There was nothing more I could say, husband. After that, I stopped complaining to my husband about my brother-in-law and mother-in-law. Instead, I called my parents, and many times. Both my father and mother told me to come home whenever I needed anything. With those words, I managed to endure home. But then my brother-in-law did something terrible. When I returned home from work, a fire truck was parked in front of my house. I approached it to see what was going on, but was stopped by a man holding a red line. Several firefighters came out of the door, and my husband and mother-in-law thanked them. What happened? After following the departing fire my eyes, I confronted my husband.
What happened? Why was there a fire at our house?
My husband looked at his mother and awkwardly.
My brother was smoking a cigarette butt which caused a fire.
I was so surprised and angry that I loud voice. They gave me the details, and it appeared that a cigarette butt had caused a minor blight. And my mother-in-law panicked and called her husband and the fire department. Then why didn't she call me? I knew because my return home coincided with the firefighters leaving. But if I had come home without knowing anything, I asked them that, but they both remained silent. Irritated by the two of them, I stormed into my brother-in-law's room and opened the door without knocking.
You can at least knock.
I looked around the room, ignoring my brother-in-law, who was getting angrier. I saw a large burn mark on the carpet under the bed. Ever since his arrival, the whole house smelled of cigarettes, and even that was stressing me out. And to top it off, my favorite pair of shoes burned to a crisp. I had reached the end of my patience. I complained to my husband in front of my mother-in-law and brother-in-law.
I've reached my limit. You need to say something too.
My husband was horrified,
What's the matter with you, Olive?
is all he said.
It's not out of a sudden. I've asked you many times before, haven't I? You should have made it clear to him.
I asked my husband to request my brother-in-law to leave the house. Then my husband sighed deeply and said in a tired tone,
You're asking me to... I kick my brother the house when he has no place to... How can you say such a thing about your sister-in-law?
Yeah, you're his sister-in-law, so you say such a thing to him. You're terrible.
The one who came at me was my husband's mother. Both of them were talking as though it was their fault. Why should I be blamed? After all, this is my precious house, inherited from my father. Aside from my husband, my mother-in-law and brother-in-law to live in the house afterward, with permission, are in a position to consent. For once, I couldn't back down.
Get out of my house!
That's what I told them.
You're kicking my brother out of the house? If you can't stand him, then you go.
With that, my husband left the room. My brother-in-law was watching thee with a grin on his face. I felt somewhat empty and went back room. The next day, when I came home from work, the key front door would not work. No matter how many times I tried, it didn't fit, and when I rang the number, there was no response. Then a notification on my phone, to a text from my husband.
I changed the locks on the house here. I'll let you back in after you get straight.
That's what it said. Don't be silly. If you want to do that, then fine, out. So I went back to my parents' house and explained this to my father and mother. After hearing what I had to say, my faces grew increasingly grim. Leave the rest to your father. My father consulted a lawyer he knew. Once that happened, things proceeded brisk pace. Sent a certified letter demanding divorce and an order to move out of the house. Then, in the presence of the lawyer, a meeting was set up at the house. As soon as we started talking, my husband said,
Divorce over something as trivial, ridiculous.
and my husband has refused to divorce me. However, when I said to him,
If you don't agree to divorce, I do if we have to go to court. When
I told him that, he gave up easily. Perhaps overwhelmed by the word court, my husband suddenly became quiet. However, when the subject of moving the house came up, he again began to his voice in protest.
This house is our home. I, your husband, have the right to.
My husband looked down at me as if I told you, oh. Then the lawyer said,
You have no right to this house.
Yes, this house was given to me before we were married. From my husband's point of view, it even shared property. I could see the faces of my husband, the in-laws turning paler and paler as they learned this. They probably thought that they would be kicked out of the house, but it was not something that they seriously expected. Their faces gradually turned pale.
Oh, Lisa, why don't we reconsider divorce?
My husband said something convenient that
What do you want to do?
the lawyer asked me.
Of course, I'm getting a divorce. I changed my mind.
I said clearly. My husband must have thought there was nothing more he could do. We agreed to the divorce and it was finalized. Mike and his family moved out of the... I am sure Mike is doing his best to alimony. I heard that the family of 3 moved into a shabby apartment. Naturally, my ex-mother-in-law and ex-brother-in-law, who could not live with the situation, became increasingly stressed. As for my ex-brother-in-law, he tried to release his stress outside the home. I hear that he was involved in an assault case against some thugs. Well, it's none of my business anymore. I got my house back in one piece and remodeled the room where my former brother-in-law used to live. The scorch marks on the floor that were bothering me are now nicely gone, and it's brighter. Now, my parents come to stay with me weekends, and we are enjoying our own way. I invited the lawyer who helped me with my case to dinner afterwards to thank him. Since then, we have been meeting res private. My home has finally become stress-free. On holidays, I sometimes invite him over for a home-cooked meal. Perhaps one day I will be able to one married life again. With this thought in mind, I am spending every day happily.